The halls of Metropolitan General Hospital buzzed with activity as doctors and nurses moved purposefully through the corridors. The rhythmic beeping of medical monitors created a familiar backdrop to the daily drama of saving lives. Among the dedicated staff was Dr. Marcus Carter, a black surgeon in his mid-30s whose presence commanded respect and whose eyes held equal measures of confidence and compassion. In this hospital, like many places across the country, the story about to unfold would prove that sometimes the most powerful healing happens not just in the body, but in the heart. Chaos erupted in the emergency room as paramedics burst through the doors, wheeling in a stretcher carrying Eleanor Bryant, a middle-aged white woman whose face had turned an alarming shade of grey. Her hands clutched at her chest as she struggled for breath, monitors beeping urgently around her. "Doctor? Carter, we've got a 53-year-old female, possible heart attack," the nurse called out, her voice cutting through the controlled chaos of the ER. Dr. Carter sprang into action immediately, his training taking over as he assessed the situation. "Let's move quickly. Prep her for an emergency angioplasty. Time is muscle," he commanded, leading his team with the precision and focus that had earned him his reputation as one of the state's finest cardiac surgeons. In the operating room, every second counted as doctor. Carter worked meticulously to save Eleanor's life, unaware of the challenge that awaited him once his patient regained consciousness. The first thing Eleanor noticed as she drifted back to consciousness was the soft presence of her daughter, Sarah's hand in hers. The hospital room was quiet, except for the gentle hum of medical equipment. "What happened?" she asked weakly, her throat dry and voice raspy. Sarah's relief was evident as she explained about the heart attack and how Dr. Carter had saved her life. The moment Eleanor registered that her savior was black, her face transformed. The gratitude that might have been there was replaced by something darker, more insidious. "Dr. Carter, is that the black doctor?" she asked, her voice tight with disapproval. Sarah's affirmative answer and praise of the doctor's skills fell on deaf ears as Eleanor turned away, her deeply ingrained prejudices overshadowing the fact that she owed her life to the very man she despised. Later that day, Dr. Carter entered Eleanor's room with his usual professional demeanor, clipboard in hand and a pleasant expression on his face. The tension in the room was immediate and palpable, but he maintained his composure as he checked her vitals and reviewed her charts. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Bryant. How are you feeling?" he asked, his voice steady and kind despite Eleanor's obvious hostility. The exchange that followed revealed the ugly face of prejudice as Eleanor snapped, "Do you always assume people want you working on them?" Dr. Carter's response was a masterclass in dignity and professionalism. He paused, meeting her gaze steadily before responding, "Mrs. Bryant, my job is to save lives, no matter who the patient is. I don't choose who comes through those doors, but I treat everyone with the same care and respect." His words hung in the air as he completed his examination and left the room, his head held high. The following days in the hospital became an unexpected classroom for Eleanor Bryant. From her position in bed 314, she had an unintentional front-row seat to Dr. Carter's daily routines. Initially, she tried to look away when he passed her room, her prejudice making her uncomfortable with his very presence. But as hours turned into days, she found herself unable to ignore the evidence of his character unfolding before her. Each morning began with Dr. Carter's rounds. Eleanor watched as he stopped at room 312, where an elderly Vietnamese man struggled with English. Instead of showing frustration, Dr. Carter patiently repeated himself, using simple terms and gentle gestures until understanding bloomed on the old man's face. He even learned to say "good morning" in Vietnamese, earning a delighted smile from his patient. In room 316, a young black mother with lupus received the same attentive care as the wealthy white businessman in 318. Dr. Carter spent extra time explaining treatment options to the mother, knowing she was raising 3 children alone and needed to understand how to manage her condition within her limited resources. When the businessman tried to demand preferential treatment, Dr. Carter remained professionally firm, explaining that every patient deserved equal attention and care. Perhaps most revealing was Dr. Carter's interaction with 7-year-old Tommy in room 310, a white child recovering from a congenital heart condition. Eleanor observed how the boy's face lit up whenever Dr. Carter entered the room. The doctor had a special handshake just for Tommy, and he always carried heart-shaped stickers in his coat pocket, a small gesture that made the frightening hospital environment a little less scary for his youngest patients. Sarah, Eleanor's daughter, watched this transformation with quiet hope. She noticed how her mother's expression shifted from outright hostility to puzzled observation, and finally, to reluctant admiration. During their long hours together, Sarah gently encouraged these observations, sharing stories she'd heard from other patients' families about Dr. Carter's dedication. One afternoon, as they watched Dr. Carter console a grieving family down the hall with genuine compassion, Eleanor broke her silence. He really cares about these people, doesn't he? The words seemed to surprise even her, as if she hadn't meant to speak them aloud. Her daughter seized the moment, her voice gentle but firm. Yes, Mom. And he cared about you too, even though you've been nothing but unkind. The weight of this truth settled over Eleanor like a heavy blanket. She turned to stare out the window, but her reflection showed a face troubled by cognitive dissonance, the struggle between her long-held prejudices and the undeniable evidence of Dr. Carter's character. The medical monitors beeped steadily in the background as she processed this internal conflict, each beep a reminder of the heart that Dr. Carter had saved, regardless of who it belonged to. In these quiet moments of observation, Eleanor began to understand that excellence and compassion knew no color. Dr. Carter's actions spoke louder than any words could have. His professionalism, his genuine care for his patients, and his unwavering dedication to healing were slowly but surely dismantling the walls of prejudice she had built over a lifetime. It wasn't through confrontation or debate, but through simple, consistent demonstrations of humanity that Dr. Carter was unknowingly teaching his most important lesson. The morning of Eleanor's discharge dawned bright and clear, sunlight streaming through the hospital window and casting long shadows across her room. The same room that had been a space of hostility just days ago now felt different, charged with the weight of impending change. Eleanor sat on the edge of her bed, already dressed in her street clothes, her hospital bag packed and waiting by the chair where Sarah had spent so many hours. Dr. Carter entered for his final rounds, clipboard in hand, his white coat crisp and professional as always. The atmosphere was different this time. The tension that had previously filled the room like a heavy fog had dissipated, replaced by something more complex. He reviewed her discharge papers with his usual thoroughness, explaining the medication schedule, dietary restrictions, and the importance of follow-up appointments. His voice remained steady and professional, giving no indication that this patient had treated him with such disdain just days before. "Your recovery is progressing well, Mrs. Bryant," Dr. Carter explained, making final notes in her chart. "Remember to take the medications as prescribed, and please follow up with your regular cardiologist next week. I've sent over all your records." He spoke while writing, his pen moving efficiently across the papers. "Do you have any questions about your aftercare instructions?" Eleanor sat there, her hands folded in her lap, fingers fidgeting with the edge of her blouse. The weight of unspoken words pressed against her chest, different from the physical pain that had brought her here, but no less demanding of relief. As Dr. Carter finished his notes and turned to leave, something inside her finally broke free. Dr. Carter. Wait. Her voice was softer than it had been since she arrived, trembling slightly with the effort of what was to come. He paused at the doorway, turning back to face her with an expression of professional curiosity. The moment stretched between them, heavy with the history of their previous interactions. I want to thank you. For everything." The words came out haltingly, each one carrying the weight of her pride, her prejudice, and the beginning of something new. Her eyes, which had previously avoided his gaze, now met his directly. In them was a mixture of emotions, embarrassment for her previous behavior, gratitude for his care, and something that might have been the first glimmer of respect. Dr. Carter's response was simple, but profound. "You're welcome, Mrs. Bryant. Take care of yourself." His voice carried no traces of resentment, no hint of triumph over her change of heart. Instead, there was only the same professional compassion he had shown from the beginning, a steady flame that had ultimately helped light the way through her darkness. As he left the room for the final time, Eleanor watched his retreating figure, her hand unconsciously moving to her chest, where the surgical scar was still fresh. The physical healing was well underway, but she knew that something else had been healed in this hospital, something that had been sick for far longer than her heart. Sarah, who had witnessed the exchange from her usual chair, reached over and squeezed her mother's hand, both women understanding that this small moment marked the beginning of a longer journey. This wasn't a dramatic conversion or a complete transformation. Prejudices built over decades don't disappear in a single moment of gratitude. But it was a crack in the wall, a first step toward something better. Dr. Carter's simple acceptance of her thanks, free from any need for vindication or recognition, demonstrated once again the very qualities that had begun to change Eleanor's perspective in the first place. As Dr. Carter left the hospital that evening, his silhouette strong against the setting sun, he carried with him the satisfaction of not just healing bodies, but potentially changing minds. Meanwhile, Eleanor sat by her window at home, watching the same sunset, her worldview irrevocably altered. The journey ahead would not be easy. Prejudices built over a lifetime don't disappear in a few days. But sometimes it takes a heart to heal a heart, and in that hospital room, a small miracle of human connection had occurred. As Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that." In this case, it was professional love, the dedication of a doctor to his patient, that began to drive out the hatred of a lifetime.